Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're diving deep into a case that still has America talking, even after all these years. The Casey Anthony case.
It really is fascinating, isn't it? I mean, it's been over a decade since the verdict, but this story just won't go away.
It's true. It's like it's seared into our collective memory.
Mm-hmm.
And, for anyone who might not remember all the details, it all started in the summer of 2008. Little Caylee Anthony, just 2 years old, vanished. But here's the thing. She wasn't reported missing right away.
Yeah, that was a huge red flag from the start. A whole month went by before anyone even knew she was gone.
It's chilling, right? A month. Imagine that. A month without knowing where your child is.
I can't even begin to fathom it. And to make matters even more complicated, the missing persons report didn't come from Casey, Caylee's mom.
It didn't.
No, it was actually Caylee's grandmother, Cindy, who called 911, frantic, absolutely frantic.
Oh, wow. So the grandmother is the one who initiates the search.
Yes, and during that 911 call, she drops a bombshell. She tells the operator that Casey's car has a strange smell, like a really bad smell. She said it smelled like a dead body had been inside.
Oh my gosh. Okay, that detail right there would send chills down anyone's spine.
Absolutely. Just imagine being one of the detectives first assigned to this case, you know? You've got a missing toddler, a month-long delay in reporting, and then bam, a car that potentially reeks of death.
Where do you even begin to unravel something like that? It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack, but the haystack is on fire.
And to make matters worse, Casey, instead of, being helpful and cooperative with the police, she starts spinning a web of lies.
Oh, this is where the whole babysitter story comes in, right?
Exactly. She invents this whole elaborate story about a babysitter named Zenaida Gonzalez, claims she left Caylee in this woman's care, but guess what?
I have a feeling it's not good.
The police quickly figure out that this Zenaida Gonzalez doesn't even exist. She's completely made up.
It's like she ricked that plot straight out of a bad TV movie. But this is real life, with real consequences.
Right. And I can only imagine what was going through the detectives' minds at this point. All those inconsistencies, the fake babysitter, her demeanor, it's like textbook suspicious behavior.
Yeah, I bet the alarm bells were ringing loud and clear for those detectives. Let's try to put ourselves in their shoes for a second. They're under immense pressure, right? The media is all over this story, the public is demanding answers, and they're dealing with a suspect who's giving them nothing but lies and dead ends. What would their next move be? Where do you even go from there?
Well, if I were in their position, I'd focus on two main things. First, I'd need to dismantle Casey's story, brick by brick. Verify that alibi, track down any potential witnesses, dig into her phone records, social media, her entire digital footprint. Anything to expose those lies.
Right, build a rock-solid case and then confront her with the evidence, hoping she'd finally crack under pressure.
Exactly. But at the same time, the second thing I'd be doing is, of course, searching for Caylee. Every single day that passes in a missing child case is critical. You're working against the clock.
Absolutely. So while they're trying to break Casey's story, they've also got this massive search operation going on.
Yep. Interviewing family and friends, combing through the area where Caylee was last seen, chasing down every lead, no matter how small. It's all hands on deck.
Must have been an incredibly intense and stressful time for everyone involved. And then in December 2008, there's a huge twist in the case, right?
A devastating one. Caylee's remains are found, and it's not far from the Anthony family home.
Talk about a game changer.
It changed everything. Now, it wasn't just a missing person case anymore. It was a potential homicide investigation, and the spotlight was firmly on Casey Anthony. Finding Caylee's remains, it was just heartbreaking for everyone involved. But for the detectives working the case, it provided a crucial shift in their investigation. They now had physical evidence to work with, forensic clues that could potentially lead them to the truth.
You're talking about DNA, fingerprints, maybe even determining the cause of death, stuff like that.
Exactly. The forensic team would have been meticulously examining every piece of evidence, the remains, any clothing found, even the surrounding area where Caylee was found. Every little detail could be important in a case like this.
Now, I remember when this case was all over the news, there was a lot of talk about the forensic evidence being particularly complex. Something about the difficulty in pinpointing exactly how Caylee died.
You're right. The forensic team couldn't determine a clear cause of death. There wasn't anything obvious like a gunshot wound or signs of blunt force trauma. And that lack of a definitive cause of death, well, that would become a major sticking point later on in the trial.
So let me try to get this straight. You've got a ton of circumstantial evidence pointing towards Casey. The lies, that strange behavior, the fact that Caylee's remains were found so close to her home. But you don't have that one undeniable piece of forensic evidence that directly links her to the death itself. Sounds like a pretty tough case to prove in court.
Oh, it absolutely was. And you can bet the defense team would seize on that lack of forensic certainty, arguing that the prosecution couldn't prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. It's a cornerstone of our legal system.
I get it. But even without that irrefutable physical proof, I'd imagine those detectives were still laser-focused on Caylee. I mean, her behavior throughout this entire ordeal, it was just so strange, wasn't it?
It was baffling to a lot of people. While her daughter was missing, Caylee was out partying, hitting nightclubs, even getting a new tattoo. It just didn't line up with the image of a distraught, grieving mother that you might expect.
Yeah, it's hard to wrap your head around that. And then, on top of all that, there were the constant lies. Not just that initial story about the made-up babysitter, but a whole string of fabrications and inconsistencies. It makes you wonder, why lie so much, especially when the stakes were so high?
That's a question that has puzzled a lot of people, and it's led some psychologists to suggest that Casey's persistent lying could be a sign of something deeper going on, something more psychologically complex, maybe even something like narcissistic personality disorder.
Narcissistic personality disorder. Could you break that down a bit? What exactly does that mean?
Well, it's a personality disorder where individuals often have this inflated sense of self-importance. They crave admiration and lack empathy. They can be extremely manipulative and deceitful, and often they struggle to take responsibility for their own actions.
So some experts believe that those traits, that need for attention, the elaborate lies, the seeming lack of remorse, all of that could be a sign of this disorder and potentially explain Caylee's behavior.
That's one theory, yes. And if we try to put ourselves back in those detectives' shoes, they're now dealing with a suspect who might be psychologically complex, potentially manipulative, and definitely a skilled liar. Talk about a challenge. How do you even approach an interrogation with someone like that?
It sounds incredibly difficult, like walking a tightrope while juggling chainsaws.
It would require a very delicate approach, that's for sure. The detectives would have to be patient, methodical, and very careful not to show any emotional reactions that Caylee could potentially twist to her advantage. They'd need to slowly build rapport, present the evidence they do have in a calm, non-confrontational way, and hope to catch her in a lie, a slip-up, anything that could help them get to the truth.
It's like a high-stakes game of chess, where one wrong move could mean the difference between getting justice for Caylee and letting a potential killer walk free.
And in this case, the stakes were as high as they could possibly be. Those detectives had the weight of the world on their shoulders, the pressure of an entire nation watching their every move.
So we've got this incredibly perplexing forensic puzzle, a suspect who could be a master manipulator, and the media spotlight shining brighter than ever. What happens next in this story? Where do we go from here?
Well, in 2011, the Caylee Anthony case finally goes to trial. And what unfolds in that courtroom would shock the entire nation, turning this case into one of the most controversial in American history.
The trial, man, it was like a media frenzy, right? I remember everyone glued to their TVs, just waiting for the verdict. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife.
It was a huge media spectacle, no doubt about it. And, the prosecution, they laid out their case. They focused on all of Caylee's suspicious behavior, all the lies she told, and all that circumstantial evidence that seemed to connect her to Caylee's death. But they kept running into that same problem. They couldn't definitively prove how Caylee died.
And the defense, what was their approach, their strategy?
Well, the defense, they went in a totally different direction. They claimed that Caylee had accidentally drowned in the family pool, a tragic accident. And to make matters even more complicated, they said that George Anthony, Caylee's own father, had helped her cover up this accidental drowning.
Oh, so they basically put the blame on the grandfather.
Yes, they painted this picture of Caylee as a victim of a really dysfunctional family, someone who felt forced to lie, to protect herself from her own father.
So it basically became a he said, she said situation, with no clear answers, no smoking gun. What did the jury do with all that conflicting information? How did they even begin to sort through all of that?
Well, after weeks of intense testimony and deliberation, the jury finally came back with a verdict that shocked pretty much everyone. Not guilty.
Not guilty. But how? Even with the lack of that clear forensic evidence, it seemed like there was so much pointing to Caylee.
Remember, in our legal system, the prosecution has to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And even though they presented a really compelling case, they couldn't completely eliminate that doubt. The defense successfully used that lack of a definitive cause of death and those accusations against George Anthony to plant just enough uncertainty in the minds of the jury.
So Casey Anthony walked free. I can only imagine the public reaction to that verdict. People were furious, right?
Oh, absolutely. People were outraged. A lot of people felt like justice hadn't been served, like Casey had somehow gotten away with murder. She quickly became one of the most hated figures in America, facing constant scrutiny, death threats, you name it.
I think it speaks to how deeply this case affected us, how it tapped into this primal need for justice, for closure. When a child dies and the person responsible is seemingly not held accountable, it leaves this open wound. It's a sense of unease and injustice that just lingers.
That's what makes the Casey Anthony case so fascinating and so frustrating at the same time. It's not just about the legal proceedings, the trial, the verdict. It's about our collective need to understand the darkness that can exist in seemingly ordinary people, in ordinary families. It makes us question everything, family secrets, the fragility of truth, and yeah, even the limits of our justice system.
And here we are all these years later still talking about it, still debating it. Casey Anthony has tried to control the narrative. She's done documentaries and interviews, but for a lot of people, the doubt remains. It's like we just can't let it go, can we?
It really shows you the impact this case had on our society. It's like this collective scar. We're still trying to make sense of it all, trying to find answers that might not even exist. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of it all, The realization that some mysteries might never be solved, that we're left with unanswered questions, and this nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, justice wasn't fully served.
So where does that leave us? We've looked at the evidence, we've considered the psychology, we've relived the drama of the courtroom. But the big question still remains, what happened to Caylee Anthony?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The mystery at the heart of this whole case. And sadly, we might never know the full truth. But maybe, just maybe, the most important thing we can take away from this deep dive is the reminder to always think critically, to examine the evidence, and to be open to different perspectives. Because the Casey Anthony case shows us that truth can be slippery, justice can be imperfect, and some stories just refuse to have a neat and tidy ending.
It's definitely a case that stays with you. Well, thanks for walking us through this incredibly complex and honestly disturbing case. And to our listeners, keep those minds sharp. And remember, sometimes the cases that really grab hold of us are the ones that leave us with more questions than answers.